afternoon. Thank you to the Lewis and Clark College for the invitation to come here and speak. I think I got it wrong in that. It's a pleasure to be the first time here in the Northwest, actually, and in Portland. I'm going to avoid confronting my colleague here about the fact that Costa Rica beat Wales a month ago in football. So we're not gonna discuss that. I'm going to be talking about free trade. I'm going to be presenting the case for free trade, and I'm pretty aware that I might be facing a very skeptical audience, to say the least, when it comes to the benefits of free trade and the implications for global development. Actually, in 1824, a great British historian, Thomas Babington Macaulay, said that free trade, one of the greatest blessings which a government can confer on a people, is in almost every country unpopular. And that's the case here in the United States, where free trade policies actually have grown unpopular in the last 5 to 6 years. The biggest misconception when you talk about globalization is that poverty is on the rise, that things are getting worse, that poverty is something new and that afflicts a majority of the world population, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. I'm going to be presenting, if I had a title for my presentation, it will be the title of this great song from Oasis in 1997, which is "It's Getting Better, Man." And actually, I'm going to show how things are actually getting better in the world on every single aspect of economic development and social development. According to historical research done by the late economist Angus Madison, world per capita income remained pretty much stagnant from the year zero to more or less the 17th century at approximately the level of $1 per day. So from year zero to the 19th century, humanity was living under poverty, $1 per day. Actually, by 1820, about 85% of the world population was living under less than the equivalent of $1 per day. However, something happened in the 19th century. And starting then, world poverty started to decline. By 1910, 65% of the world population lived in extreme poverty. By 1950, it was 55%. By 1970, the number of people living under absolute poverty was 35%. And in 1980, when I was born, it was slightly more than 30%. The latest number is 2008, and it was that 19% of the world population was living under extreme poverty. So as you can see, poverty has declined dramatically in the last 100 years. Actually, poverty has declined more in the last 15 years than in the previous 19 centuries. According to new estimates from the World Bank, again from 2008, for the first time in the history of the world, the number and the proportion of the population living under less than $1 a day is falling everywhere in the world. Not only in Southeast Asia, where of course we have the greatest accomplishments in poverty reduction in recent history, but also in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where for the first time ever, poverty is declining. China is, of course, one of the greatest examples of this. Since 1981, when the Chinese economy started opening up to the world, 660 million people have been lifted out of poverty. This is something that we will never see again in the history of the world. 660 million people live in the ranks of the poor. And this is not only poverty, but if you look at every single measurement of human well-being, things are improving dramatically. Life expectancy has gone from 31 years in 1900 to almost 70 years in 2009. Just imagine, a century ago, I would have been already in the third age. I will be already a senior with my 32 years old. And now, people are living double that. In 1950, infant mortality was 18%. That means that almost one baby out of 5 will die within a year of being born. In 2010, that rate had fallen to 4.1%. All other indicators of human well-being, such as hunger, malnutrition, access to safe water, access to sanitation, access to education, etc., had improved dramatically in the last 15 years. And the empirical evidence shows that human development indicators are all improving because people are getting richer in the world. Incomes are rising, and thus people have higher standards of living. And actually, we published this book at the Cato Institute that looks at the correlation between higher income standards and higher well-being standards. And I'm going to leave this copy here for the library. Well, some people will say, well, okay, the world is getting richer, but that still doesn't mean that the rich of the rich are getting richer. Well, the poor, are just being lifted out of poverty, but the inequality is on the rise. Well, that's not true. And actually, independent research done by 2 well-known economists, such as Sergio Pala and Xavier Sala y Martin from Columbia University, found that if we focus on inequality between persons rather than between countries, global inequality is at its lowest point since World War II. Also, we live in a more peaceful world. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the number of armed conflicts around the world has been in decline for the last half century. The number of people killed in battle has fallen to its lowest point in the post-World War II period, below 20,000 people a year by one measure. So there is no doubt that things are getting better around the world, economically, socially, and when it comes to conflict. Why is it getting better? Where am I going with all this? Well, I'm going to make some statements here that are going to submit it to you so you can debate me on the merits of these statements. No country on history has ever succeeded in getting richer and reducing poverty without having long-term economic growth. These reductions in poverty have happened because many countries around the world have experienced long-term economic growth, sustained economic growth. Also, there's no case of a country that has had, in the opposite, that has had long-term economic growth which didn't benefit the poor population. Many people say, yes, some countries grow a lot, but the poor don't benefit. Well, there's no case on earth of a country that has had long-term economic growth and the poor hasn't been benefited. If a country has a growth rate of 3% per year, this means that per capita income doubles every 23 years. If a country has a growth rate double than that, 6% per year, that means that per capita incomes double every 12 years. And there is actually research by 2 World Bank economists, David Dollar and R. Craig, that shows that on average, when a country grows, they studied 40 countries, the statistics from 40 countries, from 80 countries and 40 years. And they found that when an economy grows 1%, the incomes of the poor grow 1%. When an economy grows 10%, the incomes of the poor grow 10%. On average. This is not the case all the time. This is not the case everywhere. But on average, the poor benefit as much when the economy is growing. And now the big question is, what causes growth? What is the chemical formula that can lead to sustained long-term economic growth? Well, again, I'm going to make a statement, and that is that there is no instance of a country that has had steady levels of economic growth in the long term that hasn't had opened up its markets. So the simple question is economic freedom. But what is economic freedom? Well, we the Cato Institute, the Fraser Institute kind of published this Economic Freedom Index, which is exactly what measures what economic freedom is. This is a question that Milton Friedman, the late Nobel Prize economist, wondered aloud with some friends in the 1970s. Well, we've been discussing a lot about economic freedom, how economic freedom is good and not so, but is there a way to measure it scientifically? So they came up with this index that divides economic freedom in 5 big areas. One of them is the size of government. Of course, that free market economic freedom consists of a small government, low public spending, low taxes, no public enterprises. Another area of economic freedom is having a strong legal structure and security of property rights. That is, rule of law. Many people claim that libertarians are anarchists, that don't believe in government. No, actually, having a strong government that protects property rights and handles the judiciary system is key to economic freedom. Access to sound money. That means that the government doesn't inflate the currency and doesn't manipulate the currency. Freedom to trade international, free trade, no barriers to trade with other people in other countries. And the absence of strict regulations on credit, labor, and business. Note that free trade is only one of 5 components of economic freedom. I've been asked here to talk about free trade. But it's important to note that you can have a country with low trade barriers and with free market, with free trade. But for example, there is a pervasive lack of the rule of law, or there are strict regulations that prevent people from starting a business or engaging in transactions. Economic development will be hard to achieve. So what makes a nation rich or poor doesn't depend strictly on free trade. There are many other factors. And that's something that's important to have in this kind of debates, because I know that, for example, some people can point at a country that has a very liberal trade regime and yet is poor and yet has many flaws. Well, that depends. We have to look into other areas. Actually, again, to quote Macaulay, in 1845, he said, "It is not one single cause that makes nation either prosperous or miserable. No friend of free trade is such an idiot to say that free trade is the only valuable thing in the world." The findings of the Economic Freedom of the World Report. This is a scientific report that looks into 141 economies and rates them according to these 5 big areas that I just mentioned. We give a grade from 1 to 10 according how they measure up in economic freedom. This is a scientific report. There are no subjective values in here. There are some nations that are not included, for example, Cuba, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, because there is simply a lack of information for those countries. But we have a pretty clear view here of which countries are freer, have free economies, and which are not. And the findings are startling. Income per capita is 7 times higher in the top 25% of freest economies than the least free economies. Per capita income in the freest economies grows in average 2 percentage points faster than in the least free economies. Life expectancy is 20 years higher in those countries that have economic freedom than in those that don't. Countries with least economic freedom have a mortality rate of 63 deaths per 1,000 live births, whereas the countries with most economic liberty have a rate of 6.3 deaths per 1,000 live births. Countries with least economic freedom have an average of 41.5% extreme poverty rate, where the freest economies have an average of 2.7 extreme poverty rate. And when you compare this ranking to the rankings of the Transparency International on corruption, or Freedom House on political and civil rights, you see that the freest economies are also the least corrupt and enjoy the more political rights and the more civil rights. So these are empirical findings. This is not Juan Carlos Hidalgo just coming here and doing some blah, blah, blah about economic liberty. And again, I'm going to leave a copy of the Economic Freedom of the World Report. You can look at it. You can look at it at the conclusions that we reach, because this tool is very important, because even people who are skeptical of economic freedom agree that this is a very scientific measurement for economic freedom. Just to put it in the case of a country. Already 5 minutes? Okay. Just to put it in the case of a country, India, for example. India is a country that after independence, they didn't adopt a Soviet model, but they did have a very closed economy. And in 1980, they started opening up, very mildly, but they started opening up their economy and adopting certain reforms. Growth started increasing in the 1980s, and then it accelerated in 1991 when the government adopted a more liberal policy towards trade and regulations and so on. A colleague of mine from the Cato Institute did an exercise, and he wondered, what if India, instead of reforming its economy, opening up its economy in 1981, had done so in 1971, a decade earlier? What would have been the impact of those reforms and higher economic growth on living standards for India? And he found that if economic reform had taken place in India 1 decade earlier, 14.5 million children would have survived because of a better mortality rate. 261 million people would have become illiterate, and 109 million people would have been lifted out of poverty if reforms, very timid reforms, had been implemented a decade earlier. What happens in India and China is critical to world development because those two countries have a third of the world population. So it's important to see how both India and China are opening up their economies, are becoming more liberal, not perfectly so for sure, but at least are moving in the right direction. So the world doesn't suffer from a bad distribution of income, it suffers from a bad distribution of economic freedom and a bad distribution of free trade. If you look at this index, you see that the bottom 10 economies in the index, those that are the least open up, out of the 10, 8 are in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region of the world that is the least economic free. F.A. Hayek, a big libertarian economist, Nobel Prize also, once wrote that as long as the rules of the games are just, the end result is just. When we talk about poverty and inequality in the third world, we have to keep in mind that the rules of the game in those countries aren't just. They lack economic freedom. And research by the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto has been very paramount in showing how the poor of the poor in the third world lack property rights. They lack access to an economy. If you want to start a business in a country in the third world, you have to face a mountain of regulations, mountains of obstacles that prevent you from opening a business. And that's why De Soto estimates that 50 to 75% of the people in developing countries work in the informal sector. So you actually have a system of economic apartheid because these people don't have access to the rules of the game. They don't have access to the judiciary. They cannot engage in economic activities. So there is a long way to go before we eradicate world poverty. But thanks to free markets, thanks to globalization, there's no doubt whatsoever that we have made great progress in the last 50 years. There is no way that free trade and globalization and economic freedom are doing its job. So I think that the Gallagher brothers were right when they wrote that it's getting better, man. Thank you.